The body Scotland Yard. Found in a room that did not exist. It was during the bitter February of 1889, when London lay beneath a pall of yellow fog and the lamps of Baker Street burned at noon like dim moons, that Sherlock Holmes became involved in one of the most singular investigations of his career. Dr. John Watson had arrived at 221B shortly after breakfast. He found Holmes stretched upon the sofa in his mouse-colored dressing gown, his long fingers joined beneath his chin and his eyes fixed upon a small square of wallpaper lying on the table. The room bore unmistakable evidence of a restless night. Chemical retorts stood among the breakfast things, newspapers covered the carpet, and a violin rested open in its case near the window. In the grate, a fire struggled against the damp cold. "You have been out already," said Watson, removing his gloves. Holmes did not look up. "Only as far as your bootmaker." "My bootmaker? You stopped there before coming to me." Watson glanced down at his shoes. "I did nothing of the kind." "Then the man has sent his apprentice to you. The left heel has been newly secured, but the nails have not yet been blackened. There is also a smear of red sealing wax upon the edge of the sole. Your bootmaker seals his finished parcels with red wax, while you, my dear Watson, use blue. Since the mud upon the upper leather is dry, but that beneath the heel remains damp, the repair was made after your morning walk." Watson laughed. "His boy brought them 10 minutes before I left home." Holmes gave a slight nod, as though the matter had never admitted another possibility. "It is fortunate," he said, "that the world continues to provide small problems. Without them, the larger ones might become intolerable." He lifted the square of wallpaper between finger and thumb. It was faded green, patterned with curling silver leaves. "And what larger problem troubles you now?" Watson asked. Holmes's thin face sharpened with interest. "A dead man has been discovered in a room which does not exist." Before Watson could reply, there came a heavy tread upon the stairs, followed by a sharp knock. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her tray. "Inspector Lestrade, sir." The inspector stepped past her almost immediately. His narrow features were pinched with cold, and droplets of fog clung to the shoulders of his dark coat. Though he attempted his usual air of official composure, Watson noticed that his gloves had been buttoned incorrectly, and that he carried no umbrella. Holmes noticed more. "You came by cab from Whitehall, dismissed it at the corner, and walked twice around the block before entering," he said. Lestrade stared. "There is gray horsehair upon your sleeve, and fresh mud upon your right boot only, showing that you stepped from a cab into the gutter. You have no umbrella, though it has been drizzling for an hour, so your walk was neither long nor intended. The 2 cigar ends crushed beneath your heel are of the government issue supplied in Whitehall offices. Since you do not smoke cigars, you stood near someone who did, probably while considering whether this affair was sufficiently absurd to bring to me." Lestrade removed his coat with a sour expression. "You may laugh, Mr. Holmes, but you'll find little amusement when you see the place. On the contrary, Lestrade, absurdity is often the outer garment of logic." The inspector approached the fire and held out his hands. "At 6 o'clock this morning, a watchman named Elias Venn made his rounds through Marbury House, an empty property off Bedford Square. The building has been shut for repairs since November. At the end of the West Passage, he saw light beneath a door. A door which should not have been there," Holmes remarked. Lestrade turned sharply. "How did you know that?" Holmes indicated the wallpaper upon the table. "You sent this by messenger an hour ago. One edge bears plaster dust, the other a clean vertical tear. It was taken from a newly opened section of wall. Continue." The watchman called out, but no one answered. The door was locked. He fetched a laborer from the lower floor, and together they forced it open. "And found the body?" "A man seated upright in a chair, well dressed, about 50 years of age, shot through the heart." Watson leaned forward. "Was there a weapon?" "No weapon. No window, no fireplace, no second door." "A concealed panel?" Watson suggested. "We stripped the walls. Solid brick on every side." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And the room?" "That is the difficulty. According to every plan of the house, according to the exterior measurements, and according to the rooms adjoining it, there is no space in which it could stand. Watson believed that Lestrade must have exaggerated, but the inspector's grave expression showed that he spoke literally. "You measured it?" Holmes asked. "3 times. The west passage is 38 feet long. The rooms along it account for 38 feet exactly. Yet between the linen cupboard and the rear bedroom, there is now a door opening into a chamber 12 feet square. And on the floor above, a continuous wall. Below, a storage room with an unbroken ceiling." Holmes rose from the sofa. The languor had vanished from him. He crossed to the mantelpiece, filled his pipe, and stood gazing into the fire. "Who owns Marbury House?" "Sir Claudius Merivale." At that name, Watson recalled a photograph often reproduced in society journals. A broad, silver-haired gentleman known for his collection of medieval manuscripts and his influence in diplomatic circles. "And the dead man?" Holmes asked. "We believe him to be Edwin Vale, private secretary to Sir Claudius." "You believe?" "His papers identify him. Sir Claudius has also viewed the body." "But," Lestrade hesitated, "but he says the man is not Edwin Vale." Watson frowned. "Then the papers were stolen." "That would be simple enough," said Lestrade. "The difficulty is that Lady Merivale, the servants, and 2 clerks from Sir Claudius's office all swear that the dead man is Vale. And Sir Claudius alone denies it? He says the face is almost exact, but not quite. He refuses to explain further." Holmes drew several rapid puffs from his pipe. "Interesting. What was found in the dead man's pockets?" "A gold watch, £11 in money, a railway ticket from Dover dated yesterday, 2 keys, and a sealed envelope addressed to you." For the first time, Holmes's composure altered. His pipe paused halfway to his lips. "To me." Lestrade removed a gray envelope from an inner pocket and placed it on the table. Across its face, in black ink, were written the words, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. To be opened only after the room is found." Watson felt a chill, which had nothing to do with the weather. Holmes examined the writing without touching the envelope. "The ink is French. The paper is Dutch. The hand is English, but deliberately disguised. You opened it, naturally. It was evidence. And found?" Lestrade produced a folded sheet. "There are only 7 words." He passed it across. Holmes read the message silently. Then he gave it to Watson. "The second room will contain the living man." For several moments no one spoke. Outside, carriage wheels rolled dimly through the fog. "A second room?" Watson said at last. Lestrade nodded. "We searched the entire house. There is no second room." Holmes walked to the window and peered down into Baker Street. His tall, spare figure appeared almost spectral against the pale glass. "When was Marbury House built?" he asked. 1742. "Altered?" "Several times. The latest work began 3 months ago." "Who ordered the repairs?" "Sir Claudius." "Who holds the plans?" "The architect, Mr. Percival Crane. He claims the chamber is architecturally impossible." Holmes turned from the window. "There are no impossible rooms, Lestrade. There are only incorrect measurements, false assumptions, and men who profit from both." The inspector reached for his coat. "Then you'll come?" "In 5 minutes." As Lestrade descended the stairs, Watson watched Holmes gather his lens, measuring tape, and revolver. The detective moved with the swift precision which always revealed that a problem had taken full possession of his mind. "You expected this case," Watson said, glancing at the wallpaper. "I expected something." Holmes opened a drawer and removed another square of faded green paper identical to the one Lestrade had sent. Watson stared at it. "Where did you get that?" "It arrived 3 days ago, enclosed in a blank envelope." "Why did you say nothing?" "Because there was nothing yet to say." On the back of the paper, written in pencil so faintly that Watson had not noticed it, was a single sentence. "When Scotland Yard finds the dead room, look beneath the man who casts no shadow." Holmes slipped the message into his pocket. "Our adversary has prepared a performance, Watson. The body is merely the raising of the curtain." And the room? Holmes's expression became cold and intent. The room is the first lie. They left Baker Street together and entered the waiting fog, unaware that before the day was finished, a second door would appear within Marbury House, and that behind it, someone would be heard desperately knocking from the other side. The cab carried them through streets, drowned in yellow haze, until Bedford Square emerged like the walls of a sunken city. Marbury House stood at the northern corner, a severe Georgian building of soot-blackened brick, its windows shuttered and its steps guarded by constables. A crowd had gathered beyond the railings. Holmes ignored them and examined the mud between the pavement and the door. Watson noticed no footprints leading from the doorway, except those made by police that morning. 3 men entered after the rain began, he said. 1 heavy, 1 lame, and 1 carrying something broad beneath his coat. Lestrade frowned. You can see all that? I can see that you cannot. Inside, the house smelled of damp timber and plaster. Canvas covered the furniture, while ladders and toolboxes cluttered the hall. A nervous foreman named Briggs met them beside the staircase. No workmen were here overnight, he insisted. I locked every door myself. Holmes requested the key. Briggs produced it from his waistcoat. The brass was old, but its teeth bore bright scratches. This key has recently been copied, Holmes said. The foreman swallowed. That is impossible. Then we are making progress. They followed Lestrade upstairs. The west passage was narrow and lined with faded portraits. At its end stood the impossible door. Its oak panels were scarred, its latch rusted, and fragments of green wallpaper clung to the frame. The chamber beyond was windowless and oppressively still. A single gas bracket burned upon the left wall, though no pipe was visible. In the center sat the dead man in a high-backed chair. He wore a black morning coat and polished shoes. His hands rested neatly upon his knees. A dark stain marked the waistcoat above his heart. His smooth-shaven face was composed, with only a tightening at the mouth to suggest violent death. Holmes examined the threshold, ceiling, and corners before kneeling beside the chair. Watson studied the face. He resembles the newspaper photograph of Vale. Resemblance is a dangerous witness. Holmes lifted the right hand. The nails were clean, but a thin blue line crossed the middle finger. Ink? Watson asked. Chemical dye. Lestrade indicated the wound. The doctor places death between midnight and 2. The doctor is wrong. The body was cold. The body was made cold. Holmes opened the coat, pressed 2 fingers against the shirt, and smelled them. Camphor, salt, and melting ice. He was packed before being arranged here. Watson looked beneath the chair. The floorboards were dry. Where is the water? An important question. Holmes inspected the victim's boots. Beside the left heel lay a tiny white flake. Chalk? Said Lestrade. Wax. Holmes withdrew the Dover ticket and held it toward the gaslight. This ticket has never passed a collector's punch. The date is genuine, but the journey is false. You make every piece of evidence worthless, Lestrade complained. False evidence reveals intention. A cry sounded from the corridor. 1 constable rushed in. Inspector, there is someone behind the wall. They hurried outside. From beyond the wallpaper beside the linen cupboard came 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Lestrade struck the wall. Who is there? A faint scraping followed. Then came a voice so weak that Watson barely heard it. Do not open the door. Briggs stumbled backward. There is no door there. Holmes pressed his ear to the wall. The knocking resumed in a pattern. 2 beats, a pause, then 5. Morse? Watson whispered. No. Holmes counted the portraits lining the passage, then turned toward the chamber. The chair, he said. Move it. Lestrade and the constable dragged the chair aside. Beneath it, carved into the floorboards, was a shallow circle no wider than a dinner plate. At its center lay a black glass disc. Holmes bent over it. The gas flame reflected from every polished surface in the room, yet the disc remained perfectly dark. The man who casts no shadow, Watson murmured. Holmes reached toward the glass, but before his fingers touched it, the gaslight vanished. Something moved in the darkness. There came a muffled blow, a gasp, and the sound of a body falling. Watson drew his revolver, but Holmes seized his wrist. "Do not fire!" A narrow line of light appeared beneath the far wall. For one instant, Watson saw a tall figure standing where no doorway had existed. It wore a laborer's coat, with a white cloth covering its face. Then the wall closed. The gaslight returned. Lestrade lay unconscious on the floor, and the sealed envelope addressed to Holmes had vanished from his pocket. Holmes stared at the blank wall, his face alive with concentration. "Adversary has corrected his first mistake," he said. "What mistake?" "He allowed us to find the room." From the corridor came one final knock. This time, Holmes answered it. Holmes raised one hand for silence and tapped the wall with the ivory handle of his lens. Twice, a pause, then 5 times. For several seconds, nothing answered. Lestrade stirred upon the carpet, groaning, while the constable bent over him. Then, from beyond the plaster, came a new sequence: 1 knock, 3, 1, and 4. Holmes's expression sharpened. "It is not Morse," Watson whispered. "No, it is a map." He crossed to the row of portraits and counted them again. There were 9 in all, each depicting some severe Merivale ancestor. Holmes stopped before the 4th portrait, a dark painting of a thin-faced woman holding a silver fan. 1, 3, 1, 4, he murmured. "First row, 3rd object, 1st row, 4th point." He ran his fingers along the frame. At the upper right corner, he found a tiny brass stud. "Stand back." When he pressed it, the portrait swung outward. Behind it lay a shallow recess containing a copper speaking tube and a brass lever. Briggs stared. "That was never on the plans." "Plans record what an architect admits to building," Holmes replied. He spoke into the tube. "Who are you?" A breath rattled at the other end. "Edwin Vale." Lestrade, now seated against the wall with a swelling above his brow, looked up sharply. "The dead man is Vale." "No," came the faint reply. "He is my brother." Then there was a metallic clang inside the wall, followed by a cry and silence. Holmes seized the lever. It resisted, then moved with a grinding motion. A section of paneling beside the linen cupboard slid backward, exposing a passage scarcely 2 feet wide. Cold air flowed from it, carrying the odor of wet stone and lamp oil. "Lanterns," said Holmes. They entered in single file. Holmes first, Watson behind him, then Lestrade and the constable. The passage descended by 5 steep steps and turned sharply between brick walls. It seemed impossible that such a space could exist inside the measured dimensions of the house. Holmes held his lantern close to the floor. "Notice the dust, Watson." There were many boot marks, but only along the edges. The center was covered by a strip of gray felt. To hide footprints? To conceal sound. After 15 yards, they found the speaking tube severed and hanging from the wall. A smear of fresh blood marked the bricks beneath it. "Vale is injured," said Watson, "or wishes us to believe so." The passage ended at an iron door. Its lock had been forced from the opposite side, and beyond it lay a chamber containing a table, water jug, mattress, and smoking oil lamp. Leather straps hung from the wall. One was stained darkly. On the table stood a photograph of 2 young men, identical in face but different in bearing. One smiled openly. The other stared with grave suspicion. Across the bottom, someone had written, "Edwin and Arthur Vale, 1867. Lestrade snatched it up. Twins. Holmes examined the mattress. "One man slept here recently. He left less than 10 minutes ago." "There is nowhere to go," said the constable. Holmes pointed upward. A square of ceiling had been cut away, revealing a rope ladder. They climbed into the attic, where fog leaked through broken tiles. At the far end, a roof hatch stood open. Lestrade rushed toward it, but Holmes caught his sleeve. "Look first." A thin wire stretched across the floor at ankle height. It led to a loaded pistol fixed behind a beam. Lestrade's face paled. "The man in the laborer's coat?" Watson asked. "Expected pursuit," said Holmes, "but not necessarily escape." He cut the wire and approached the hatch. On the roof, wet slates showed footprints leading toward the neighboring house. Halfway across, the prints stopped. No jump could reach the other roof, Lestrade said. Nor did anyone attempt one. Holmes crouched and touched a footprint. The edge crumbled beneath his finger. Plaster casts, placed while dry, then dampened by the fog. Our fugitive never crossed this roof. A shout rose from below. They returned to the hidden chamber and found Briggs in the doorway, his face white. "Sir Claudius has arrived," he said. "He demands that every man leave the house." Sir Claudius Merivale waited in the drawing room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and silver-haired, with the manner of a statesman. Beside him stood a pale young woman in mourning dress, introduced as his niece, Miss Eleanor Merivale. Sir Claudius looked directly at Holmes. "You have no authority here. Neither, apparently, have the laws of architecture. This house contains private family arrangements. It also contains a murdered man." At that, Eleanor gripped the back of a chair. Sir Claudius's gaze hardened. "The body is not Edwin Vale." "We know," said Holmes. "It is Arthur." The old man's composure broke for an instant. Eleanor whispered, "Arthur died 20 years ago." Holmes turned toward her. "Who told you so?" Before she could answer, a clock chimed somewhere inside the house. It struck 11 times, though Watson's watch showed 9:30. At the final stroke, a scream echoed from above. They ran to the impossible room. The body was still seated in the chair, but its head had been turned toward the door. Between its lips was a folded strip of paper. Holmes removed it and opened it. The message contained one sentence. "At noon, the living brother will murder the dead one." Watson read the sentence twice before handing it back to Holmes. Lestrade examined the corpse's mouth. "This paper was not there before." "No," said Holmes. "It was placed while we were upstairs. But the room was guarded." The constable at the door flushed. "No one passed me, sir." Holmes looked not at the man, but at the ceiling. Holmes dragged the chair aside and struck the floor with his cane. The boards returned a hollow note. "The dead do not turn their own heads," he said. "Nor do sealed rooms remain sealed merely because a policeman watches the entrance." He removed the black glass disc from the circular groove beneath the chair. Under it was a narrow iron spindle. When Holmes twisted it, the floor beneath the corpse rotated soundlessly through half a turn. Watson stared as the chair moved with it. "A revolving platform," he said, "balanced beneath the boards. The chamber can present either half of itself to the doorway. While we examined one side, someone entered the other." Lestrade dropped to his knees and peered into the opening. "There is another room below? A shaft, perhaps, connected to the passages." Holmes replaced the disc and turned to the dead man. He inspected the lips, the teeth, and the wound once more. Then he pressed the corpse's left wrist and frowned. "What is it?" Watson asked. "The left arm was broken many years ago and badly set. In the photograph, Arthur Vale holds his left shoulder lower. Edwin does not. So this is Arthur. It is a man with Arthur's injury." Sir Claudius stood rigid in the doorway. Eleanor remained behind him, one hand pressed to her throat. Holmes faced the older man. 20 years ago, Arthur Vale was reported drowned at Portsmouth. No body was recovered. Edwin entered your service 6 months later. Why? Sir Claudius's mouth tightened. That concerns no one. It concerns the person who chilled this body, planted false papers, and built a theater inside your house. I built nothing. Holmes held up the brass key from the hidden passage. This bears your family crest. Eleanor looked at her uncle. You said the old passages had been sealed. They were. Then who reopened them? Before Sir Claudius answered, the distant clock struck a quarter hour, though only 3 minutes had passed. Holmes immediately crossed to the mantel and opened the clock case. The mechanism had been removed. Behind the painted dial ran a narrow speaking tube. The chimes are being played from elsewhere, he said. To frighten us? Watson asked. To control us. Everyone in this house has been made to think about noon. He looked through the window. The fog had thickened. pressing against the glass like dirty wool. "Lestrade, place men at every exterior door. No one leaves. Watson, remain near Miss Merivale. Sir Claudius, you will come with me." "I will do no such thing." Holmes stepped close enough that the two men stood face to face. Then, at noon, one of the Vale brothers dies again, and this time, the responsibility will be yours. Sir Claudius went pale. They descended to the drawing room. Holmes ordered the curtains closed and the lamps lit. He placed the photograph of the twins upon the table, beside the Dover ticket and the strip of green wallpaper. Eleanor sat near the fire. Her composure had returned, but Watson noticed that she watched the door rather than Holmes. "Miss Merivale," Holmes said, "when did you last see Edwin Vale?" "Yesterday evening. He left after an argument with my uncle." "About what?" "A letter." Sir Claudius struck the table. "Eleanor." She ignored him. "The letter claimed Arthur was alive. Edwin demanded money and said the truth would ruin this family." "What truth?" "I do not know." Holmes studied her face. "You are an accomplished liar, Miss Merivale, but not an experienced one." Tears brightened her eyes. "I am trying to protect someone." "Edwin?" "No." A scrape sounded behind the closed curtains. Lestrade tore them aside. The window was latched, but written across the misted glass were 4 words. "Ask her who she buried." Eleanor gave a strangled cry. Holmes touched the writing. Made from outside with a gloved finger. "We are on the 2nd floor," said Lestrade. Holmes opened the window. A narrow painter's cradle hung against the wall, suspended from the roof. A figure crouched in it. Lestrade seized the rope and dragged the cradle level. The occupant wore a laborer's coat and a white cloth over his face. Beneath the cloth was a wax mask molded in the likeness of Edwin Vale. The figure did not resist. When Watson pulled away the mask, he found not a man but a wooden dummy weighted with sand. Pinned to its chest was a pocket watch. Its hands stood at 12. At that instant, every clock in Marbury House began to strike. The noise rolled through the walls, overlapping and discordant. Eleanor rose in terror. "It is not noon!" Watson shouted. But Sir Claudius had already drawn a pistol. He aimed it at the doorway, where a man had appeared. The newcomer's face was identical to that of the corpse upstairs. "Edwin!" Eleanor whispered. Sir Claudius fired. Holmes struck his arm aside. The bullet shattered a mirror, and in its broken reflection, Watson saw a second figure standing behind them. That man also wore Edwin Vale's face. For one astonishing instant, no one moved. The man in the doorway stood with both hands raised. He was pale, unshaven, and breathing heavily. Behind Watson, the second figure remained perfectly still, his features composed and bloodless beneath the lamplight. Sir Claudius stared from one to the other. "Which of you is Edwin Vale?" The man at the door answered first. "I am." The second smiled faintly. "That is precisely what Arthur would say." Lestrade stepped between them with his revolver drawn. "No one moves until this is settled." Holmes appeared almost indifferent. He bent over the shattered mirror and selected a narrow fragment of glass. "Names are poor evidence," he said. "Bodies are less obliging liars." He approached the man at the door. "Your left sleeve." The stranger hesitated, then rolled it back. A long white scar crossed his forearm. "From the carriage accident at Bath," Eleanor whispered. The second man immediately exposed the same scar. Watson leaned closer. It was identical in position and length. "Copied," said Holmes. "Which one?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes ignored him. "Gentlemen, show me your hands." The doorway man's fingers were raw, with broken nails and dark bruising around the wrists. The other man's hands were clean, though his middle finger bore the same blue chemical stain Watson had noticed upon the corpse. Holmes took the stained finger and rubbed it with the edge of his handkerchief. The blue mark vanished, revealing pale wax beneath. "A false fingertip," Watson said. The man tore free and reached inside his coat. Lestrade struck him before he could draw the weapon. They fell against the table, scattering the photograph and railway ticket. Watson seized the man's arm, while Holmes pulled a small glass syringe from his pocket. The doorway man recoiled. "That is what they used on me." "Who are they?" Watson asked. But the prisoner laughed. The sound was wrong. It had the harsh, hollow quality of a voice, forced through a narrow tube. Holmes caught the man by the jaw and pressed his thumb beneath the ear. A strip of flesh-colored material lifted from the skin. "A mask!" cried Lestrade. Holmes peeled it away. Beneath was the narrow, sweating face of Percival Crane, the architect. Sir Claudius staggered backward. "Crane?" The architect spat blood onto the carpet. "You should have allowed the first shot to land." Holmes examined the wax likeness in his hand. "An excellent piece of work. The mold was taken from the dead man, I presume." Crane said nothing. The true Edwin crossed the room unsteadily. Eleanor hurried to support him, but he shrank away. "You buried him," he said. Her face emptied of color. "Not Arthur," she whispered. "No, the other one." Sir Claudius closed his eyes. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Take Crane's coat and search every seam." The inspector found a reel of fine wire, a second syringe, 2 small keys, and a folded plan of Marbury House. Unlike the official plans, this drawing showed a network of passages, revolving chambers, and narrow voids between the walls. "The impossible room," Watson said. "Not impossible," Holmes replied. "Movable." He spread the plan upon the table. The west chamber rested upon iron runners and could slide into a hollow space above the dining room. When shifted, it stole several feet from adjoining rooms, whose false walls moved with it. "The measurements changed, depending upon which doors were open," said Watson, "and each investigator measured only one arrangement." Lestrade pointed to a black square beneath the drawing room. "What is this?" Crane's defiance vanished. Holmes noticed it. The place where the living man was kept. They hurried downstairs to the cellar. Behind the wine racks, Holmes found 4 iron bolts concealed beneath fresh mortar. Edwin watched from the steps, trembling. "Do not open it," he said. "That is what the voice told me." "What voice?" asked Watson. "My brother's," Sir Claudius whispered. "Arthur is dead." Edwin turned upon him. "You have said that for 20 years. Holmes removed the final bolt. The stone panel swung inward, revealing a chamber lined with black felt. At its center stood a coffin. Eleanor gave a soft cry. The lid was not nailed down. Lestrade raised it. Inside lay no corpse, but a phonograph connected to copper tubes that disappeared into the walls. Beside it were wax cylinders labeled with names: Edwin, Eleanor, Claudius, Arthur. Holmes selected the cylinder marked Arthur. Crane suddenly broke from the constable's grip and kicked the cellar lamp. Darkness swallowed them. There was a rush of feet, a blow, and the iron panel slammed shut. Watson heard Eleanor scream. Holmes struck a match. Crane had vanished. Edwin lay unconscious, and Sir Claudius was clutching his chest. The coffin was now empty. Only the phonograph remained, turning by itself. From its brass horn came a calm voice. "If Holmes has reached this room, then Crane has failed. At 12 tonight, Marbury House will contain 1 room less, and 1 body more." The cylinder clicked to a stop. Holmes stared at the dark tunnel beyond the coffin. "No," he said quietly. "Crane has not failed. He has merely delivered us to the final stage." Above them, machinery began to turn. Dust drifted from the ceiling, and the floor shifted beneath Watson's boots. Holmes extinguished the match. "Everyone against the wall," he ordered. "The house is moving, and someone intends to bury the truth inside it." The first movement came as a slow groan beneath the stones, followed by a violent jolt that threw Lestrade against the coffin. Somewhere beyond the walls, chains rattled over iron wheels. The black felt chamber seemed to tilt, though Watson knew the sensation might have been caused by the floor sliding beneath them. Holmes remained motionless, one hand pressed to the wall. "Do not follow the sound," he said. "It is being carried through the speaking tubes." The grinding increased. The stone panel through which they had entered vanished sideways, replaced by an unbroken surface of brick. Eleanor struck it with both fists. "We are sealed in," "Temporarily," said Holmes. Watson relit the fallen lamp. Its flame revealed Edwin lying beside the coffin, a red mark across his temple. Sir Claudius had sunk onto a packing crate, his face gray and damp. Watson knelt beside him. "Your heart? An old weakness." "That is not all." Sir Claudius looked toward Eleanor, then lowered his voice. "There are chambers beneath this house that even Crane did not design." Holmes heard him. "Built for whom?" The old man closed his eyes. "For men who were never officially here." A section of ceiling descended with a hiss. Lestrade dragged Edwin clear as a heavy wooden platform lowered into the chamber. Upon it stood a chair, and upon the chair sat the corpse from upstairs. The dead man had traveled through the house. Eleanor backed away, covering her mouth. Holmes stepped forward and examined the chair's legs. They fitted into brass sockets on the platform. "The rooms do not move," Watson said. "The bodies do." "Both," Holmes replied. "Crane constructed a system in which walls, platforms, and passages alter together. It is a conjurer's cabinet built on the scale of a house." Lestrade pointed to the corpse. "Why bring him here?" A ticking answered. Holmes tore open the dead man's waistcoat. Beneath the shirt, strapped against the ribs, was a small clockwork device connected to two glass bulbs. "Everyone down!" They threw themselves behind the coffin. Holmes ripped the mechanism free and hurled it toward the descending platform. The bulbs shattered before the device struck, releasing a cloud of white vapor. Watson held his sleeve over his mouth. "Poison? Ether and phosphorus," Holmes said. "Enough to ignite in a closed chamber." A spark snapped within the clockwork. Blue flame raced across the vapor. The platform flared, but Holmes overturned the coffin lid and smothered most of the fire before it reached the felt-lined walls. In the confusion, Edwin regained consciousness. "Arthur," he whispered. Holmes knelt beside him. "Tell me where your brother is." Edwin stared at the corpse. "That is not Arthur." Sir Claudius rose abruptly. "You identified him yourself." "I said he wore Arthur's face." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Whose body is it?" Edwin looked toward Eleanor. She was crying silently. "His name was Simon Rusk," he said. "An actor from Limehouse," Lestrade swore. "Then where is Arthur Vale? Alive, perhaps?" Crane kept changing his answer. "And the man Miss Merivale buried?" Holmes asked. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the crate. 7 years ago, a stranger came to Marbury House. He claimed to be Arthur. My uncle refused to see him. That night, I found the man in the garden with blood on his coat. He collapsed before he could speak. "You buried him?" Watson asked. "I believed my uncle had killed him." Sir Claudius stared at her. "You never told me. You taught me that this family survived by silence." Holmes studied them both, then turned to the corpse. He lifted the dead man's chin and examined the skin behind the ear. A thin seam became visible. "Another mask," said Watson. Holmes peeled it away carefully. Beneath the wax lay a narrower face, bruised and unfamiliar. "Simon Rusk," Edwin said. The room shuddered again. One wall began to slide upward, revealing a dark corridor beyond. At its far end burned a single red lamp. Crane's voice came through the tubes. "Mr. Holmes, bring Edwin Vale to the Red Room. Come alone, or the foundations will be released." Lestrade raised his revolver. "He is bluffing." Holmes glanced at the cracked mortar above them. "No. The house rests partly upon lifting frames. Release them unevenly, and the western side collapses." Sir Claudius gripped Holmes's sleeve. "You cannot give him Edwin." "I have no intention of doing so." Holmes removed his coat and draped it over the actor's corpse. He then took the wax mask of Edwin Vale from Lestrade and pressed it over the dead face. Watson understood. "You mean to send the corpse? I mean to discover whether Crane can recognize the man he has imitated so often." They fastened the corpse upright in the chair and pushed it toward the corridor. In the red light, the wax features appeared disturbingly alive. Holmes whispered instructions to Lestrade, then took Edwin's place behind the chair. The passage narrowed as they advanced. Hidden gears clicked within the walls. At the final turn, a steel door opened. Beyond it was a circular chamber filled with mirrors. Crane stood at the center, holding a pistol against the head of a bound man. The prisoner had Edwin Vale's face. Crane smiled at Holmes. "You brought the wrong brother." Before Holmes could answer, the bound man opened his eyes and said, in Sir Claudius's voice, "So did you." Holmes smiled faintly. Crane's smile faltered. The bound man sat beneath a hanging lamp, his wrists tied behind a steel chair, and his face covered by the same likeness of Edwin Vale. Yet the voice behind the mask belonged unmistakably to Sir Claudius. Holmes did not look surprised. "A speaking tube beneath the chair," he said. "Your prisoner has said nothing." Crane pressed the pistol harder against the man's temple. "One step more and he dies." Holmes rested both hands upon the corpse's chair. In the mirrors, a dozen Holmeses stood behind a dozen dead men, while Crane multiplied into a ring of armed figures. "You have spent months teaching this house to lie," Holmes said. "Now you cannot trust your own eyes. I trust this weapon. You trust its reflection." Crane glanced toward the nearest mirror. Holmes shoved the corpse forward. The chair struck a brass rail in the floor. At once, the chamber revolved. Swung inward, lamps moved behind colored glass, and every figure broke into fragments of light. Crane fired. The bullet shattered a mirror where Holmes's reflection had stood. Lestrade, concealed beneath the draped coat, sprang up and seized Crane's wrist. They struggled across the turning floor. Watson rushed toward the prisoner, but Holmes caught his shoulder. "Not that chair." A thin wire ran from its rear leg into the wall. Watson followed it to a copper cylinder fixed above the prisoner's head. Another trap. Pressure released from the seat will discharge it. Holmes stepped between the moving mirrors, timing each turn. He reached a control lever and forced it downward. The chamber stopped so abruptly that Crane and Lestrade fell together. The pistol slid away. Crane kicked Lestrade aside and lunged for it. A cane struck his hand. Edwin Vale stood in the doorway, pale but upright, supported by Eleanor. Crane stared. "You were locked below. You designed the doors," Edwin said. "You never learned the old passages." The architect backed toward a mirror. Holmes spoke quietly. "That panel opens into a shaft." Crane froze. "Or perhaps I wish you to believe it does." For the first time, fear entered Crane's face. Every exit, reflection, and patch of floor had become uncertain. He remained still until Lestrade rose and fastened handcuffs around his wrists. Holmes approached the bound figure. He inspected the wire, followed it behind the chair, and cut a second cord beneath the armrest. "Lift him now." Watson and Edwin raised the prisoner together. The copper cylinder discharged with a dull click, but nothing emerged. "Empty," Lestrade said. "Delayed," Holmes replied. He pulled them back. A second later, a needle shot from the chair and buried itself in the wall. The prisoner collapsed into Watson's arms. Holmes removed the wax mask. Beneath it was Briggs, the foreman. Eleanor stared. Why would Crane imprison his own workman? Briggs opened his eyes. "Not his workman," he whispered. "His jailer." Crane laughed bitterly. "You believe him?" Holmes examined the bruises on Briggs's neck. "He was restrained recently, but the marks on his wrists are older. He has worn chains before." Briggs looked toward Sir Claudius, who had entered with the constable. The old man gripped the doorway. "Benjamin Rusk," he said. Watson glanced at the corpse. "Rusk? The dead actor's relation?" "His father," Holmes answered. Briggs closed his eyes. Sir Claudius crossed the chamber. "You were sentenced for treason." "I was sentenced because you needed a traitor." The words silenced the room. Holmes turned to Sir Claudius. The hidden chambers were built for secret government interrogations. Men entered Marbury House without records, were questioned, and disappeared through another address. Sir Claudius's face hardened. "It was necessary work." "And Arthur Vale discovered it," Edwin said. Crane twisted against the handcuffs. "Arthur discovered more." Holmes looked at him. He discovered that one prisoner died here under Sir Claudius's authority, and that the official report named Arthur as the responsible clerk. His supposed drowning buried the scandal, Eleanor whispered. Then Arthur was framed. Perhaps, said Holmes. But framing a man does not prove him innocent of what followed. A bell rang beneath the floor. Once, twice, Crane's expression changed. You have delayed too long. The red lamp flickered. From below came tremendous metallic blows. Holmes knelt and placed his palm against the floor. The lifting frames are releasing. Lestrade seized Crane by the collar. Stop them. I cannot. You built the mechanism. Arthur altered it. At the name, Edwin stepped forward. Where is he? Crane looked toward the mirrors. One by one, their surfaces darkened as shutters slid behind the glass. In the final mirror, a face appeared where no person stood. It was older than Edwin's, scarred along the jaw, but unmistakably his twin. Arthur Vale looked out from behind the glass. Brother, he said. Edwin moved toward him. Holmes blocked his path. Arthur's image smiled. Sherlock Holmes, he said through the hidden tube. You have solved the room. Now solve the house before it falls. The floor dropped half an inch. Dust burst from the ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness, masonry collapsed. Holmes turned to Watson. Take everyone to the eastern stairs. And you? I must find the one room Crane did not draw. Arthur's face vanished from the mirror. In its place appeared a final message, traced slowly from the other side. Only the dead know the way out. Then the mirror cracked silently from top to bottom. Holmes waited until Watson had guided Eleanor, Edwin, Sir Claudius, Briggs, and the constables toward the eastern staircase. Lestrade remained behind, gripping Crane's arm while steadying himself against the trembling wall. You heard him, Lestrade said. We must leave. Arthur said the dead know the way out, Holmes replied. That was not a threat. It was an instruction. Another shock passed through the floor. One darkened mirror tore free and shattered across the chamber. Behind it lay a narrow cavity, containing chains, pulleys, and an iron rod descending into darkness. Holmes inspected the fractured glass. The crack began from the rear. Arthur broke it deliberately. To reveal this machinery? To reveal what the machinery conceals. He pushed aside the chains and found a brass plate fixed to the brickwork. Upon it were engraved 5 names. 4 had been crossed through: Jonathan Rusk, Michael Dene, Peter Harrow, and Elias Crow. The 5th was Arthur Vale. Briggs stared at the first name. My brother. Sir Claudius, who had returned despite Watson's protest, seemed to age before them. Holmes turned. These were the men held in the unrecorded chamber. There was no 5th prisoner, Sir Claudius said. Then Arthur added his own name. A deep rumble rolled beneath the house. Crane looked toward the iron rod with alarm. If that drops completely, the western frame will collapse. Holmes placed his fingers around the rod. It vibrated in short, regular pulses. Not collapse. Signal. He tapped the rod 3 times. From below came 3 answering blows. Someone is alive beneath us, Watson said. Or someone wishes us to descend. Holmes removed a lamp from the wall and stepped into the cavity. A ladder ran beside the iron rod. Lestrade secured Crane to a pipe, ordering 2 constables to watch him, then followed Holmes downward. Watson came next. The shaft descended farther than the cellar. Moisture gleamed upon the bricks, and the air grew cold. Halfway down, Holmes stopped at a narrow ledge, where a human hand protruded from behind a timber brace. Watson raised the lamp. The body belonged to Elias Venn. A cord had been looped around his throat. His boots were absent. Then the heavy footprints at the entrance were his, Watson said. No, his stockings are dry. Holmes searched the coat and found a notebook. Its final page carried a hurried sentence. The room moved at 10 minutes past midnight. A gentleman came out, but his shadow remained inside. The black glass, Watson murmured. A darkened observation window, Holmes said. Venn saw a man through it, while another figure stood before the light. 2 men appeared to be one. Lestrade looked down the shaft. Arthur and Crane? Perhaps? A metallic snap sounded overhead. The ladder jerked. "Down!" Holmes ordered. They descended rapidly as the upper section folded into the wall. The shaft ended in a circular stone chamber, with no visible door. At its center stood 5 coffins, each bearing one of the names from the brass plate. 4 were open and empty. The 5th, marked Arthur Vale, was closed. Edwin had followed them. Before anyone could stop him, he rushed forward and lifted the lid. Inside lay old clothes, a rusted chain, and a human skull. Edwin recoiled. Sir Claudius entered behind him and whispered, "Arthur!" Holmes picked up the skull and examined the teeth. "This is not your brother." "How can you know?" Edwin demanded. "It belonged to a woman." Eleanor, standing at the shaft entrance, gave a faint cry. Holmes looked at her. "The stranger you buried 7 years ago. Where?" "In the garden. Beneath the cedar." "No. You buried an empty coat weighted with stones." She stared at him. "I saw a face. You saw a wax face in darkness. Someone needed you to believe Arthur had returned and died." Briggs moved toward the 4th coffin, which bore Jonathan Rusk's name. Beneath its lining he found a folded packet wrapped in oilcloth. Sir Claudius lunged for it, but Lestrade intercepted him. The packet contained memoranda, orders, and a list of payments. Holmes read quickly. "These prove that prisoners were brought here illegally," Watson said, "and that Crane's father designed the first movable chamber," Holmes added. "Percival inherited both the plans and the grievance." A slow clap echoed from the stone wall. Arthur's voice filled the chamber. "Very good, Mr. Holmes. But you still mistake the servant for the master." One coffin slid aside, revealing a doorway. Beyond it stood Crane, no longer handcuffed, holding Eleanor before him with a knife at her throat. Lestrade spun toward the shaft. The constables above had vanished. Crane smiled. "Arthur freed me." "No," Holmes said. "You freed yourself before we descended. The handcuffs were wax impressions, prepared to break." Crane's smile faded. Holmes stepped nearer. "You are not working for Arthur. You are trying to prove that he exists." Edwin stared at him. "What do you mean?" "The voice, masks, messages, and old name upon the plate appear only when Crane controls the mechanism. We have seen Arthur's image, but never Arthur. The lamps died. A pistol fired. When Watson relit the lamp, Crane lay bleeding beside the doorway. Eleanor had vanished, and Holmes knelt over the bullet mark in the wall. From the darkness beyond came Arthur's voice, no longer distorted by tubes. "You are nearly right, Holmes." Holmes rose. "Nearly," he said, "is the most dangerous distance from the truth." Holmes lifted the lamp and entered the passage from which Eleanor had vanished. Watson followed, with Lestrade close behind. Edwin remained beside Crane, whose wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. Sir Claudius protested, yet Holmes ordered him to stay. The corridor was older than the others. Its bricks were dark with moisture, and the floor sloped beneath the neighboring houses. No machinery sounded here. Only the faint retreating steps of 2 people disturbed the silence. "Arthur has Eleanor," Watson said. "Someone has Eleanor. You still doubt him?" "I doubt every man who introduces himself from behind a wall." At the first junction, a drop of blood marked the left passage. To the right lay a torn fragment of Eleanor's black sleeve. Lestrade pointed left. "Crane's blood, placed with a finger," Holmes replied. "It did not fall from a moving wound." He chose the right-hand passage. They entered a low chamber furnished as a study. Maps covered the walls. Shelves held wax masks, wigs, bottles of dye, false beards, and molds of hands. Upon a desk stood several phonographs, connected to a switching board. Watson saw cylinders labeled with dates, stretching across 20 years. "Arthur's voice," he said. "Many versions of it." Holmes placed one cylinder upon the machine. A younger voice said, "Claudius knows. Do not trust Edwin." Another, recorded years later, repeated the same phrases in a harsher tone. Lestrade searched the drawers. Letters and receipts. Holmes examined the handwriting. All written by Crane. Then Arthur is an invention? No. Arthur lived. The invention is the man we have been encouraged to imagine. A muffled cry came from behind a curtain. Eleanor sat bound within a shallow cupboard. Holmes cut the gag. "He went through the floor," she gasped. "He wore Arthur's face." "Did he speak?" "No." Holmes examined the trapdoor. Dust lay thick upon it, unbroken except for 2 clean impressions shaped like knees. He did not descend. He knelt and pretended to while the lamp was out. A draught moved the curtain. The rear wall stood open by several inches. They entered another corridor. Lestrade rushed toward running footsteps, but Holmes caught him before he crossed a pale line in the floor. Iron spikes dropped from the ceiling and stopped inches above their heads. "Crane's craftsmanship," Lestrade muttered. "No, this mechanism is 20 years older." At the corridor's end, wooden steps ascended into the garden. Fog curled through an open hatch. Beneath the cedar tree waited a tall, stooped man, with gray hair and a scar along his jaw. His resemblance to Edwin was undeniable. "Arthur Vale!" Watson whispered. The man raised empty hands. "I did not take the girl." Holmes approached him. "You broke the mirror. Yes? You freed Crane. No? You sent the messages. Only the one upon the mirror. Why remain hidden? Because Sir Claudius would have me arrested before I could speak. For treason? For murder?" Edwin appeared at the hatch, supporting himself against the frame. "Arthur." The brothers stared at one another across 20 years. Arthur's face trembled. "You grew old in my place." "They said you drowned," Edwin replied. "I was meant to." Sir Claudius came behind him, carrying the pistol Holmes had struck aside earlier. "You should have remained dead." Lestrade drew his revolver, but Sir Claudius seized Edwin and pressed the pistol to his side. Arthur stepped forward. "Let him go. You caused this," Sir Claudius said. "The files, the rooms, the bodies. I returned for the files. Crane brought the bodies." Crane's voice sounded from the garden door. Another lie. He stood there, pale from blood loss, holding a revolver. Behind him was Briggs, with a cord around his neck. For a moment, 4 weapons and 3 prisoners formed a frozen circle beneath the cedar. Holmes alone appeared calm. "Crane, you murdered Simon Rusk," he volunteered. "To wear Arthur's face?" "To die in it. My father lost everything because of Merivale. My brother understood that justice required sacrifice. Simon was shot through the heart. He knew the risk. No, he knew only that he was to imitate Arthur and frighten Sir Claudius. You killed him because a living accomplice could expose you." Crane's revolver shifted toward Holmes. "You cannot prove it. The blue dye beneath Simon's nail came from the molding compound in your study. He fought while you pressed the mask over his face. You strapped his shoulder to imitate Arthur's old injury." Arthur stared at Crane. "You used my name. I perfected it. A ghost frightens men more effectively than a witness." Holmes turned to Sir Claudius. "You knew the corpse was not Edwin because you knew Arthur's distinguishing mark. Arthur lacks the final joint of his right little finger, an injury concealed in every photograph." Arthur raised his hand. The shortened finger was clearly visible. Sir Claudius's pistol wavered. "There is one murderer here," Holmes continued. "One blackmailer, and one man guilty of older crimes. But only one of you arranged the impossible room." Crane smiled faintly. "Which one?" "The man who needed Scotland Yard to find it." A shadow moved across the wall behind Crane, though no one stood before the garden lamp. Holmes suddenly shouted, "Down!" A shot cracked from inside the house. Crane fell backward. His revolver discharged harmlessly into the fog. Briggs tore himself free and dropped behind the cedar. In the doorway stood the constable who had guarded the impossible room. He removed his helmet. Beneath it was another wax face. Holmes stared at him with fierce satisfaction. "At last," he said, "the man who casts no shadow." The disguised constable retreated into the house. Holmes pursued him, with Watson and Lestrade at his heels. They found the entrance hall empty. The front door remained locked, and every window was secured. Yet wet footprints crossed the floor and ended before a tall mirror. Holmes touched its surface. The glass moved beneath his hand. Behind it lay a narrow lift, descending into darkness. Upon its platform rested the missing sealed envelope and a pocket watch ticking toward midnight. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, bearing Sir Claudius's signature, and an order dated 20 years earlier. Arthur read over his shoulder. "That document condemned me." "No," Holmes replied. "It condemned someone else." He turned the page toward the light. Beneath Sir Claudius's signature appeared a second name, written in faded ink: Percival Crane. From far below came the sound of the lift reaching its destination. Then a man began to laugh in Arthur Vale's voice. Holmes stepped onto the lift before Lestrade could object. Watson followed, as did Arthur, while Edwin remained above with Eleanor and the wounded men. Lestrade seized the control rope, and the platform descended through a brick shaft. The laughter continued below them in Arthur's voice, yet Arthur himself stood beside Watson, silent and rigid. "The phonographs again," Lestrade said. "No," Holmes replied. "Listen to the breathing between the words. A machine repeats sound. A man repeats intention." The lift stopped in a circular vault lit by 3 oil lamps. Its walls were covered with ledgers, government seals, and packets tied in red ribbon. At the center stood the disguised constable, now without his wax face. Watson recognized him as neither servant nor policeman. He was a lean man of perhaps 40, with colorless eyes and a pale scar across his throat. Arthur stared. "Michael Denny." The man bowed. "Dead for 19 years, Holmes said. "Officially." Denny held a revolver in one hand and a burning taper in the other. Around his feet, paraffin covered the floorboards. "One spark," he said, "and every secret in Marbury House disappears." Holmes glanced at the ledgers, "Including the evidence that you survived." Denny smiled. "Survival is no longer important." Arthur stepped forward. "You sent the order in my name. I preserved your name. Men obey ghosts more readily than failures." Lestrade raised his weapon. Dean lowered the taper toward the paraffin. Holmes lifted one finger. "If you burn the room, you destroy the document proving that Sir Claudius ordered Jonathan Rusk's death." Dean's hand paused. "You have not read the order correctly," he said. Holmes unfolded the paper found in the envelope. Sir Claudius authorized the removal of a prisoner. Percival Crane signed as witness. But the prisoner's name was altered. Arthur looked over Holmes's shoulder. The ink beneath Jonathan Rusk's name showed faint scratches. "My name was there," Arthur said. "Yes?" Holmes turned to Dean. Arthur discovered the secret imprisonments. Sir Claudius ordered him detained, not killed. Crane altered the order, so Jonathan Rusk was placed in Arthur's cell. Rusk died during interrogation, while Arthur escaped through the moving rooms. Dean's pale face tightened. "Crane blamed Sir Claudius," Holmes continued, "and later convinced Benjamin and Simon Rusk that the Merivales alone had murdered Jonathan. He used their grief to build his revenge. Crane was a coward," Dean said. "But not your master." Holmes moved around the paraffin-soaked boards. "You supplied the police uniform, moved Simon's body, struck Lestrade, and removed the envelope. Crane designed the visible deceptions. You remained unseen." Denny laughed again in Arthur's voice. "I learned every voice used in these rooms. Men confess more easily when they believe the dead are questioning them." Watson saw Arthur recoil. "You were a prisoner here," Holmes said, "for 11 months. And when you escaped, you did not expose the system. You took control of it." Denny's expression hardened. "This house made me nothing. I decided it would make others nothing too." He dropped the taper. Holmes kicked an open ledger across the floor. It struck the taper before it touched the paraffin, sending it beneath an iron cabinet. Lestrade fired, but Dean vanished behind a revolving shelf. Holmes rushed after him. Beyond the shelf lay a narrow gallery overlooking a chamber of gears. Dean was already crossing an iron bridge toward a second lift. Arthur followed. "Stop!" Watson shouted. Dean turned and fired. The bullet struck the rail beside Arthur. Holmes dragged him behind a support beam. Lestrade aimed, but the machinery began to move. The bridge shifted sideways, separating them from Dean. "He is releasing the western frame," Arthur said. "The house will collapse." Holmes studied the gears. "No, he wants us to believe it will." He pointed to a chain marked with white paint. Unlike the others, it remained slack. "The true support mechanism has not moved. These gears operate only the walls and clocks." Dene reached the lift and pulled its lever. Nothing happened. Holmes held up the missing pocket watch. "You require this key." The watch's winding stem was shaped like a square iron pin. Dene raised his revolver toward Arthur. "Throw it." Holmes did so. The watch landed halfway across the moving bridge. Dene stepped toward it. At that moment, the bridge reversed. He lost his balance and caught the rail with one hand. The revolver fell into the machinery. Holmes crossed swiftly and seized his wrist. For several seconds, Dene hung above the gears. "Help me!" he gasped in his natural voice. Holmes pulled him upward. Dene collapsed upon the bridge, and Lestrade handcuffed him. "You saved him," Arthur said. "A man's guilt does not grant me the right to become his executioner." From above came bells. This time they struck midnight correctly. Holmes opened the watch. Inside was a tiny photograph of 5 prisoners. Arthur and Dene stood among them. Behind the group, partly hidden, was a younger Sir Claudius. Watson studied the picture. "He was imprisoned too?" Holmes nodded. "Which means Sir Claudius did not create the system." Dene smiled despite the handcuffs. Holmes looked toward the upper shaft. "We have captured the murderer," he said, "but not the man who built the first impossible room." A slow clap sounded from the lift above. Sir Claudius very slowly descended toward them, holding a pistol in one hand and the final missing ledger in the other.